This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking on, well, maybe the single most influential figure in all of Western history, Aristotle. And we're going to perform a kind of historical autopsy that it really changes everything.
Yeah, for 2,000 years, everyone basically treated Aristotle as this master architect, right?
Yes.
Of one single perfect philosophical system. If you studied logic or physics or ethics, you started with him. But the core consensus now among researchers, it's completely flipped.
That's right. The really startling idea here is that the collection of works we have, the Corpus Aristotelicum, is almost certainly not the unified system we all thought it was. It's something, well, something far stranger.
And much more chaotic.
Yeah.
What we're actually holding are the fragmented, unedited, and, often contradictory internal documents of a massive ancient research organization.
And this is so interesting because it probably lines up with the feeling you've had yourself. I mean, if you've ever actually tried to read his core logical texts, like the categories or the physics, you might have felt that the structure was less like, a lofty philosophy book.
Right.
And more like an extremely structured, almost corporate organizational tool.
That intuition you have is spot on. It's perfectly aligned with the frontline research. And the goal of this deep dive is to validate that exact feeling. We need to stop seeing the Lyceum as just Aristotle's personal school.
Yeah, him walking around in a toga.
Exactly. And start seeing it as the world's first proto-university, a colossal research institution.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to reread Aristotle, but through the lens of organizational management. We're going to treat his logic, the engine of his whole project, as an operations manual used by literally hundreds of staff. And if we do this right, you'll walk away with a completely new understanding of why Aristotle sounds the way he does.
So let's start with the texts themselves. What is it about the writings that makes scholars now think, hang on, these are institutional documents, not finished philosophy?
Well, when you read Aristotle, it can feel jarring, right? You get these sudden jumps in topic. An argument will start really strong and just stop mid-thought. And crucially, the terminology isn't even consistent.
I mean, a definition that's key in one chapter might shift or completely vanish in the next. You even find arguments that flat out contradict earlier conclusions.
If a modern philosopher submitted a book like that, with the jumps, the abrupt endings, the inconsistent phrasing, it would be seen as, a deeply flawed text, unpublishable maybe?
But here's the pivot, the aha moment. Those features, the inconsistencies, the jumps, the abruptness, they aren't flaws if you just look at them differently.
Right.
They're completely natural features of, say, unedited drafts, internal memos, records from a discussion, or research notes put together by a huge team on a deadline.
Think about your own workplace. If you pull together meeting notes from 3 different departments, you're going to get different terminology, right?
Of course.
And internal minutes, they just jump from one point to the next without all the polished transitions you'd need for a public report.
It changes the entire picture. It's not one brilliant man trying to write the perfect book.
Yeah.
It's a massive team trying to basically compile an encyclopedia of the entire known world.
So the core conclusion is Aristotle's huge, complex system wasn't really for a single person to study alone. It was a practical, comprehensive workflow manual for a huge team.
A huge team running a huge project. And to really get the complexity of that manual, you have to understand the terrifying scope of the organization that needed it. What was the Lyceum?
We really do need to just get rid of that image of Aristotle strolling with a dozen rich kids. The research suggests the Lyceum in 4th century BCE Athens was a comprehensive university and research center unlike anything else in the ancient world.
And when you say unmatched, what made it so different from, say, Plato's Academy just down the road?
Plato's Academy was, mostly a training ground for the elite in philosophy and politics. The Lyceum was operationalized science. It probably employed not just dozens, but potentially hundreds of staff.
Hundreds? You mean full-time collectors, surveyors, data organizers, analysts, scribes?
All of it. Even librarians. Hundreds of specialized personnel in the 330s BCE. That sounds more like the bureaucracy of the Persian Empire, not a Greek school. That kind of scale implies a ton of money.
It absolutely does. And a big chunk of that funding came from his old student, Alexander the Great. But this money wasn't just for teaching philosophy 101.
No.
It was for global data collection. The Lyceum sent out survey teams across Asia, across Africa, to collect specimens and information. This wasn't local knowledge. The goal was global, systematic knowledge.
No, it's not a library where you just keep finished books. It was a data acquisition center, a processing plant.
Precisely. I mean, sure, they collected rare books, but the real work was the field work. They had specialized teams for botany, zoology, astronomy, physics, medicine, you name it. The goal was to study everything.
Okay, give us the one concrete example that really shows that ambition.
The best one is the work they did for his book, Politics. To get the foundational data, the Lyceum collected and analyzed 158 city constitutions.
158.
Just think about the logistics of that, getting 158 detailed government documents from all over the Greek world and beyond, then having your staff translate, compare, categorize, and analyze them all.
That is the very definition of an institutional effort. So the structure of the Lyceum, it had to be administrative. You've got your data collection teams, your classification teams, the library, your analysis teams using logic and math, and then finally the synthesis team doing philosophy.
And Aristotle's sitting right at the top of that org chart. He's the director, the chief editor, the principal investigator. He set the standards. He was basically the CEO of the world's first real research institution.
And if he's the CEO, then the big question is, how do you enforce quality control across hundreds of people collecting data on everything from starfish to Spartan law? And that brings us right back to his logic. It had to be the standard operating procedure.
It's the only way. It's the only thing that makes sense. When you have 100 people in different fields, a zoologist, a historian, an astronomer, all collecting data, you need one universal system, a single SOP to make sure all their findings can eventually be compared and synthesized.
So how would a junior research assistant at the Lyceum have used a text, like the categories in his day-to-day work? How practical was it?
Oh, incredibly practical. Let's say a staff member is out collecting biological specimens in Asia Minor. When they write their report, they need to classify their findings consistently. The categories, which defines things like substance, quantity, quality, relation, that was the institution's catalog manual.
Yeah, okay.
It made sure that every new thing they found, whether it's a new plant or political office, was classified using the same 10 basic headings.
So a report comes back to Athens, and Aristotle or his senior staff can instantly compare two totally different data points because they're structured the same way. That's quality control.
Exactly. And then once the data is categorized, you have to analyze it. That's where the syllogism comes in. That wasn't just some abstract philosophical exercise. It was the required analysis manual. It was the standardized way to perform inference and draw conclusions. If your researchers use that form, major premise, minor premise, conclusion, you can check their work. It's predictable.
That's brilliant. It turns all that complexity into just operational efficiency. But what about the four causes? Material, formal, efficient, final. That feels so metaphysical.
But it was the ultimate reporting tool. It was their explanatory template. Anytime you describe a phenomenon, the movement of a star, the collapse of a government, your report had to explain all four causes. What's it made of? What gave it its form? What started it? And what's its purpose? It forced consistent explanations across every single department.
And the topics, which deals with arguments, that must have been the guide for internal debates.
It was the discussion template, exactly. When the staff got together to argue about conflicting data, the topics gave them the structure for a proper debate. It showed you how to build a strong argument and, maybe more importantly, how to tear down a weak one. This whole huge, complex, logical system was necessary because the organization it served was just as huge and complex.
And this is where the story gets, well, it gets tragic. Because we have the manual, but where is all the research? The very complexity of the organization leads us to the horror of the archives collapsing.
The scale of what we've lost is, it's genuinely hard to wrap your head around, and it explains almost everything we misunderstand about Aristotle. The leading hypothesis, as backed by strong evidence, is that the surviving corpus Aristotelicum is less than 1% of the total documents created by the Lyceum.
Less than 1%. You think about a modern university, it produces thousands of papers, millions of data points, memos. Aristotle Center would have been the same?
We don't even have to guess. We have that one devastating data point. We know the Lyceum compiled 158 constitutions for the politics. How many of those survived?
Just one, the Constitution of Athens.
Exactly. Which gives us a concrete, heartbreaking 0.6% survival rate for the core political data.
Yeah.
And if you apply that rate to the botanical reports, the zoological findings, it means 99.4% of the Lyceum's actual empirical research is just gone.
That is just the clearest symbol of catastrophic data loss I can imagine. Think what we would know if we had the other 157 documents.
And the loss wasn't sudden. like the Library of Alexandria. It happened in 2 stages. The first collapse started right after Aristotle and his successor, Theophrastus, died. The documents were passed down to heirs who weren't scholars, and the Lyceum itself faded.
And the stories about what happened to the texts are just criminal.
They are. The ancient historian Strabo tells us the texts were basically hidden in a basement or a damp cellar somewhere to keep them safe, but they were just left there to rot, damaged by moisture and insects for centuries.
So the institutional knowledge of the ancient world was literally just decomposing in the dirt.
Pretty much. And then the second collapse came centuries later, in the Roman era, when these rotten fragments, chaotic, damaged, barely readable, were rediscovered. They were a total mess. Andronicus of Rhodes, in the 1st century BCE, took on the huge job of organizing them. The collection he pieced together is what we have today.
So we're essentially reading texts that have died and been resurrected twice, with serious trauma along the way. Why did these specific bits survive and not the raw data?
Because what survived were mostly the lecture notes and teaching materials, the stuff teachers and students were actively using and copying. That gave them a better chance. But the vast amount of primary source data, the raw reports, the experimental notes, the 157 constitutions, that kind of stuff is rarely archived for the long term. Even today, it was just lost.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. Aristotle was the CEO, his logic was an SOP manual, and 99% of his actual research is gone. So later generations get this chaotic, incomplete pile of debris, and they try to make sense of it.
And that's the fundamental tragic misunderstanding of intellectual history. Asking, what is the Aristotelian system, is just the wrong question. It's like asking today, what is the singular philosophical system of the University of Tokyo?
Right. The system is the messy, varied output of a whole institution, not the clean thoughts of one person.
A singular, coherent Aristotelian system never really existed in the way later centuries imagined it. The whole concept was basically an invention, born out of necessity.
How so?
The structure we know today, logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, that was largely an organizational tool invented by the medieval church. As they were building the first universities, they needed textbooks. They needed a curriculum. So they took the chaotic remnants of the Lyceum's internal manual and forced them into this neat structure.
They took an organizational flowchart, chopped it up, and turned it into a university textbook.
And that created centuries of problems. Think of Thomas Aquinas. He had to actively limit Aristotle's scope, making philosophy a handmaiden of theology, just to control all the contradictions in these messy texts.
And then, when the Renaissance kicks off, you get reformers like Descartes and Newton attacking this system as the thing holding back progress.
But here's the beautiful irony. They weren't really attacking Aristotle, the researcher. They were attacking the flawed, fragmented texts and the distorted curriculum that the Middle Ages had invented from the wreckage. They were attacking a broken, centuries-old office manual that didn't make sense anymore.
So the great intellectual battle of the early modern era, the fight against Aristotelianism, was really a fight against a ghost, an illusion created by massive document loss.
Which brings us right back to our central finding. Aristotle was a director, the Lyceum was a research giant, and the texts we have are the organizational debris. The idea of a single perfect Aristotelian system is just a beautiful historical illusion.
And this leaves us with a final, really provocative thought for you to take away. We know that something like 99.4% of the Lyceum's research output is gone forever. But what if it wasn't? What if that 95 or 99% of primary data, the research reports, the full archives, all 157 of those other constitutions, the full botanical encyclopedias, what if all of that had survived?
If that complete, verified institutional output, armed with its logical SOP, had been available to Renaissance scholars, would modern scientific history have begun not with Galileo and Descartes, but centuries earlier with Aristotle himself? The sheer lost potential of that ancient research center is, well, it's the most humbling lesson we can take from this deep dive.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.